In this episode, we speak with Jack Mardack, the co-founder and chief impact officer of Oyster, a human resources platform for globally distributed companies. Oyster automates cross-border employment and makes it easy for growing companies of all sizes to tap the global talent pool and provide a great employment experience to remote hires around the world. Jack Mardack's mission was to redress the unequal distribution of job opportunities by encouraging organizations to think more globally about their talent. He is motivated by a vision of the world in which no talent is wasted because of location. I am your host, RJ Lumba. We hope you enjoy the show. If you like the episode, click to follow.
RJ Lumba is the executive chairman of Market Insight Media and the managing partner of GrowthCap. He is the host of Great Entrepreneurs, a podcast for driven entrepreneurs and business owners. Our podcast covers all topics related to the entrepreneurial journey, from ideation to execution to optimization and to reaping the rewards of a well-run business. In the minutes ahead, we'll share with you unique insights and tactics from some of today's most accomplished and inspiring entrepreneurs.
Jack, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today. It's a delight to be with you.
Likewise, RJ. Thank you so much for the kind invitation.
Where I thought we'd kick off is a little bit about your background. It seems like you've been part of the tech and startup ecosystem for some time, but perhaps your true first founding or co-founding experience is at Oyster. Do I have that correct?
Yes, that's correct. I snooped your LinkedIn a little bit, and we have a common banking background. You won't see that stuff on my LinkedIn, as it's kind of irrelevant to tech, as you mentioned, but my career started as an analyst. I worked for a couple of international banks in New York, and it was a great foundation in business fundamentals. It taught me how to read financial statements, how to deconstruct companies, how to look critically at industries. And so it was hugely helpful later in my career, but perhaps like yourself, it was ultimately a little boring for me, a little too non-creative. I longed for the exhilaration of inventing new things. And so I left New York in the late 90s and left banking behind and moved on to have, I guess, what I would describe as a very lucky location dependent, very much, Silicon Valley location dependent career in, working for high tech startups, the most recent of which is Oyster. You are right to observe that it is my first time as a co-founder. And the trajectory there, though, is repeatedly having seen the process of company creation, the various exercises of scale and go-to-market and product market fit. And so I think I had developed a robust capability in terms of what it took to get a new company off the ground. But in parallel with that, and I think this is going to be more relevant to our conversation, I was developing an appreciation for the ingredients necessary for an organization to pursue both positive impact and commercial success, which is really where the nexus with my co-founder, Tony, comes in. I was, like many people, for example, had a day job, but was a volunteer with various nonprofits in San Francisco. I was on the board of a San Francisco nonprofit for a number of years. And that came out of a desire, as a lot of people feel, to give back, to have some agency in the dimensions of positive impact. In the case of the nonprofit on whose board I served, that impact was focused on children who were in the dependency court, basically foster kids who were removed from their homes under the most exigent of circumstances, as you can imagine. So I learned from the inside what nonprofits do well and don't do well. Among the things that I concluded that they don't do well or are not appropriate for is our biggest global scale problems, like economic inequality, the environment, racial inequality, gender inequality, the list goes on. And so the genesis of Oyster for myself is very much born out of that experience, where I recognized in Tony James's, my co-founder, Tony's brilliant idea circa July of 2019, that in Oyster, or in the company that would become Oyster, we had the opportunity to create an organization that could combine oil and water, combine global scale positive impact, and also become a huge commercial success. So that's my trajectory. And I'd be very excited to tell you more about Oyster as well, but please.
Yeah, fantastic background. And thank you for, mentioning kind of that social or impact dynamic or side to the origin story, I'd like to actually touch on something else before we head into Oyster more fully, in that it's a different story being a key part of a startup versus being the person in charge and kind of owning the co-founder role. What was most kind of surprising to you, being in that co-founder seat?
Well, when you're creating a company, you're not just setting down the path to acquire customers and generate revenue. Part of that is getting other people to believe in the idea. And so it was kind of an existential responsibility. And so it was the first time that I had shouldered that existential responsibility that was directed at people that we wanted to come join us, directed at investors, directed at prospective customers, directed at the greater public, the greater world. We're trying to set an example with Oyster. And as its impact officer, I am keenly concerned with and interested inspiring other entrepreneurs, but with that example. Those were all firsts, yes.
Got it. There's this recent proliferation of entrepreneurs kind of sharing more about the personal side to the journey. Was it a lonely endeavor for you?
No, not at all. And by lonely, you mean, did I feel lonely from sharing myself as part of my business persona for the very first time? No, I think the opposite, if that's what you mean. I felt for being accepted and received and heard and embraced in spite of, let's say, exposing all of my humanity. I felt the opposite of lonely, I think.
I guess where I was going with that was, recently Brian Chesky of Airbnb had talked about all the
Ah,
stress kind of weighing on him. And it's not like every day you can bounce these ideas off other people. Like ultimately, a
oh, I
lot of the
see.
decision
Yes.
making can rest with one key person. Yeah, that's kind of where I was going. I'm not sure if that was your experience at all.
I understand. Leadership is by design alienating, and particularly at the very highest levels where there are no peers within the organization. And so I think that requires that one look to other social opportunities, other people to have those conversations with perhaps peers in other organizations, or just have important ideas to contribute from other domains of experience that are not necessarily the startup world. And so I'm lucky to have some people that are like that for me, not the least of which is my co-founder, Tony. And so the loneliness has been experienced, but I've been very lucky to have some people that I can turn to when I need to share everything, let's say, or share things without constraint or without political or other implications, if you understand. That gets harder, I think, as you get higher. So I've learned that, and I definitely empathize with other leaders now in a way that I could not before.
You seem to be scaling quite quickly. You've raised a lot of money. You've got notable investors backing the company. We started off the conversation talking about your kind of impact focus. And I believe, and I was going to ask why Oyster. I think I understand why Oyster. The world's your oyster. Is that part of it?
Oh,
Or
why the name? Yeah, it's in there. And so we looked at the brand building opportunity, let's say, where a global employment platform. Well, first, let me tell you what Oyster is so that I can then couch my telling of the brand story in that. And so, as I intimated earlier, our mission is to make the world a more equal place by making it easy for companies everywhere to hire people anywhere. As you may know, being able to just hire someone that happens to live in Argentina or Albania or Algeria, as if that geographic difference weren't significant, has been very challenging for companies for a long time. And so this remained ripe for disruption. And so Tony and I recognized that we could both solve for unsolved needs of global employment. Like what would it take to just make that easy? How can we bring software and technology to bear on that problems? And hey, guess what? That is also potentially a machine for global scale positive impact by making it possible for folks in the emerging world who have not historically had access to the best knowledge work jobs now have access, at least conceptually, from the adoption of remote work. Let us build a platform that allows companies to just do that as if it weren't challenging at all. And so we provide the infrastructure that empowers organizations to create work environments where global talent can thrive. That is who we are building for, but for the company that is excited to embrace a hybrid format, or perhaps like us, an entirely distributed, entirely remote organizational format, who are excited to combine that with the benefits of broad geographic diversity, right? So armed with that perspective, we were very excited to build a potentially global brand. And we fell in love with Oyster as a brand vehicle for a couple of reasons. There didn't seem to be anything wildly popular in the world named Oyster. After the animal itself, there's the Oyster card in London. Once upon a time, there was this site, Oyster, that was like travel related. I think they were acquired by Google, but in any event, no one is spending money on promoting that brand. So it seemed available. And the term oyster itself, as you observed, has some lovely metaphorical significance, as well as some sayings like the world is your oyster. And that applies to the company perspective. Talent acquisition, the world is your oyster, but also to the job seeker. Hey, don't worry about where you live. The world is your oyster. And then there are niceties like finding that pearl of an employee. So the list of metaphorical utilities goes on. But thanks for liking it. And thanks for asking about how we came to be named Oyster.
Yeah, I think if there's an overarching theme to this conversation, it's that you're able to balance this mission of really trying to have equal kind of opportunity across the globe, which is a very kind of social oriented mission, but you're a for profit entity. I did notice you're a public benefit corporation. You do have traditional investors. Is it difficult balancing, or have you kind of figured out in your mind how to do this, elegantly?
That is a great question. So the example that we're trying to provide to other entrepreneurs is that this does work. And by this, I mean combining global scale, positive impact, and becoming a global scale commercial success. Indeed, they do more than mix, like oil and water traditionally don't mix. They can come together in a 1+1=3 kind of way. So I believe that before the pandemic, there was already a lot of energy in the shift of capital towards companies that were not just making a profit, but also in some way making the world a better place by focusing on an important acknowledged global scale problem, as I said, like the environment, like in our case, economic inequality, and there are others. And what the pandemic did, as it did in so many other areas, is it heightened and accelerated the conversation about that. And you may have seen some of the fallout. It's become a very politically charged conversation based on the question, can an organization both serve its profit and growth oriented stakeholders and also serve other stakeholders that can be designated in the world, as in our case, job seekers of the world, particularly those in the emerging world. They are, for us, a key stakeholder group. So not surprisingly, there was an entrenched position in that was keen to protect the access to capital for organizations that say, wouldn't pass even an easy test of, are you making the world a better or worse place? And so that's why we saw conversational flare up around this subject over the last couple of years, and in coincidence with the other changes that we've seen as a result of the pandemic. And so at the very beginning, Tony and I were very excited by this oil and water mixing idea. And that was the idea that was at the core of our seed round fundraising. And it's been at the core of reasons to join, reasons to invest in Oyster from the very beginning. And I would say that in our case, that combination has indeed been 1+1=3. And so I would love for other entrepreneurs to be inspired by that example and look for their own opportunities to build organizations that have impact embedded into their business models in the way that ours does. And I think that is the takeaway that I would love to leave with other aspiring entrepreneurs. You can build companies with positive impact embedded from the very beginning. And that needn't be a compromise at all to commercial success, revenue growth, profitability, et cetera, but rather the opposite, something that, as I said, 1+1 = 3.
Going back to the product, I was curious if it has a similar feature to Upwork in that it's a means for identifying who in across the globe could be relevant. It seemed when I was researching on your site that it was more so your software would help you after you identified someone.
So the big picture for us is that helping companies to find as well as hire and pay compliantly people all around the world is the size of the picture necessary for us to embrace the full opportunity. And so we started with one part of that problem so far, which is building a global employment platform that softwareizes and makes easy and automated and trustable and far less expensive than historically it has been the hiring and paying of people anywhere in the world. But we have also built a network of talent partners. We recently announced that network so that we can do more than just say we can do that to our customers after they've found the talent that they're looking for, but increasingly through our partners, be able to connect them with great talent all around the world and say, particularly in the emerging world. So we've started on, you might say, the harder foundational stuff of putting in place a platform that makes the management of a global workforce easy for even a modest people team. But our big picture is definitely to do everything we can to focus employers of the world on the world and specifically into those countries where great talent lives, but historically there has been no access for them to these great knowledge work jobs that are now available, say, through the modality of remote working.
And I imagine Oyster itself is largely a remote
Entirely.
entirely.
Entirely. Yes. I mean, we could talk for hours about that alone. But no, we Tony and I were big fans before the pandemic of like Automatic and Buffer and these other companies that were saying, hey, this is amazing. It's more than the obvious, which is just sort of you don't have to show up in the office. There are benefits, organizational benefits, benefits to productivity that obtain from this choice. We were all bought in on that before the pandemic. And indeed, had the pandemic never happened, we would have been what would still have been, I guess, somewhat of an oddity, which is that early stage company that's saying, no offices for us. But then the pandemic happened and made that a very popular choice, indeed, a necessary choice for companies of all sizes. But we're currently about 600 people representing over 70 countries of the world and very proudly with no offices. And we've built a fantastic way of working based on first principles and the inspiration of companies that came before us. I think one of the important learnings from the pandemic and say from our experiences like ours is that companies should be so much more deliberate in designing how they work on their stuff than they have been. I mean, one of the benefits of the office is you don't need instructions. You just kind of show up. You know how it works. We've known how it works for decades. But the next step requires becoming much more deliberate. And the advantages of that is that the work ends up being much more perfectly fitted to the context of what that company is working on and how they're trying to work on it than, say, if you're in the box of the office, both literally and metaphorically.
And where do you spend most of your time?
As of the last 2 years, after having spent 2 decades in the Bay Area, I now live in San Diego, where my wife and I moved here to be closer to her family and to enjoy the sun, let's say, with a greater frequency than we get it in the Bay Area.
I'm curious because I've heard different takes on this, but sometimes the environment in which the founder is in and where kind of like natural social interactions can take place, like being in Silicon Valley can have a different effect than being in other places. I'm not sure if that's true or not. Have you noticed any difference?
Sure. And I would say that it has been true. And I think it remains true, but perhaps less necessary. And by that, I mean that the necessity for being in a particular location, to starting a company or having a certain kind of career, I think that necessity has been lessened. How much, it's very hard to assess. But let's say that while before the pandemic, the odds of success, if the founders didn't move from wherever to San Francisco to either meet another founder or to get closer access to investors or to get closer access to talent, I think that is now less essential. I think it's gone down as a success factor, right? This idea of location. But with that said, absolutely, I think there are still tremendous benefits of being able to meet people casually out in the world in physical environments. San Diego is very different than the Bay Area in that way. But one positive is that there's a lot more interest in people who are moving to this part of California, to this part of the United States, in meeting and connecting. And so the barrier of access to some kinds of folks, let's say, has gone down because everybody's sort of interested in connecting and saying, hey, who else is in the San Diego area who's working on startups or other relevant domains?
Excellent. We're coming up on the tail end of the conversation. I have two questions I like to ask. Before I ask those, one question is, what is the best advice you've ever been given?
Oh, it's okay to be silly. And I'm paraphrasing some great advice that I got mainly by example from an early educator in high school. And that was key because, as you're a young man sort of trying to figure out how you should present yourself in the world, to see someone who was in a position of responsibility, respect, combine that was transformational for me. I haven't been nearly as silly in this conversation as I have a capacity to be, but maybe we'll book some time and we have that to look forward to. The other piece of advice that came from a variety of people is it's okay not to have a 10-year plan. It's okay to let your career be like a river that sort of bends as it makes its way, as it carves its way through the land. That makes a lot of sense. And I've been very lucky to have abided that because I didn't sweat certain turns of the river, let's say, if I had been really focused on specific outcomes. And instead, I was guided by more basic principles like find the smartest people, or more recently, find people who have a similar vision of the world and care about similar things as you do, and build things with them. And whatever happens will be good and satisfying no matter what. That's what I would share.
Excellent. Okay, last two questions. One is, can you tell us about a person who has had a profound influence on you?
Yeah. Well, I spoke already of some folks that I've met. And so some of the minds in the world that were important to me as I was developing my own way of thinking in the very beginning, certainly Descartes and Richard Feynman, as I was, late high school, early college, building, let's call them my frameworks for understanding the universe. Then as I became interested in understanding the self, Jung, and a great Swiss analyst named Alice Miller, who I heartily recommend reading. And then as I became interested in aesthetics, Roland Barthes, who is a French philosopher who wrote a tremendous book on photography that is about so much more, actually, called Camera Lucida. And I'm in the midst of a sort of a fourth chapter where I'm drawing inspiration from people who are looking at the world's problems through a similar lens, or looking at some of the systems, let's say, that keep perpetuating unsustainability on a global scale. That's the idea space that I'm in right now. And so I'll mention Al Gore, who I think has a great perspective on leadership and who I was very lucky to meet for the first time this year as well.
Last question. Can you tell us about a charity, cause, or other endeavor that you're passionate about?
Yeah, I will give props and attention to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Earlier, we talked about the idea of getting entrepreneurs excited about the world's global scale problems. I think the United Nations has done a fantastic job at creating a framework and an understanding around some key issues that we face in the world that are great input for the entrepreneurs of the future, for the impact entrepreneurs of the future. So the UN SDGs, if you don't know what they are, go read them. They will be the basis, I predict, of future entrepreneurial effort.
Thank you. Thank you for that insight. Thank you for taking the time today. It's been a wonderful conversation. I know our audience will enjoy this as well.
Thank you, RJ. Can't thank you enough for the invitation and the pleasure.